Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about some of the most powerful races in Total War Warhammer 3 that do have significant drawbacks in their campaigns, but they are still very powerful races even if their campaign playstyle can suffer from some of the issues that they do have. I'm not talking here about a race like the Empire, which is weak, or a race like the Vampire Counts where the only major issue in that campaign is the fact that you have to fight a lot of battles manually. No, it's not something like that. We're talking here about actual issues that will impact the growth of your empire, the growth of your campaign, how fast you can do the campaign itself. Number 4, we have the beastmen, who are a pretty powerful race. In particular, Taurox as a legendary lord is absolutely ridiculous. You want to see the real Scarbrand? Taurox is the real Scarbrand with his rampage mechanic and his momentum, his ability to reset his movement points during the course of a campaign. And that is great, that is a lot of power. Each of the beastmen legendary lords, with the exception of poor Kazrak, but even he does have his own benefits. And the beastmen do have a substantial amount of campaign power because they don't really hold settlements, they hold hearthstones. Now, hearthstones, even at tier 1, do have a pretty sizable garrison, beyond the fact that you're generally going to generate attrition in an area next to them. So that makes them very unappealing to attack for the AI. So your hearthstones are pretty safe. And if you have an army plus the hearthstone garrison, especially like a higher level hearthstone garrison, the chances of you actually losing a campaign is very, very low. That's the upside. You also have free unit recruitment, but you need to increase the caps. This is where we start getting into the issues, because there's two things you need to do if you're playing as the beastmen. You also only start with 1 army capacity from the very start of your campaign, which is a similar issue that the Tomb Kings have. But you can overcome it in a better manner than the Tomb Kings can. So here's the thing about the beastmen. You need to do a ritual. The way it works is you put down a hearthstone in a settlement, and then you can fight battles in settlements or on an open field that gives you marks of ruination. Once you've gathered enough, you can do the ritual and increase your ruination level. So level 1 would require 24, level 2 would require 59 in total, and that's the point where you would get your army capacity. And actually a lot of units being unlocked as you play more and more. But this ruination meter is actually one of the bigger problems the beastmen do have, especially when controlled by the AI, because the AI has an issue with doing these rituals, has an issue with increasing their marks. Now, as a player, you can obviously wait and pick the most advantageous time to do the ritual. Like over here, I put a hearthstone over here in Clan Current, and I'm then gonna go wipe out the Venom Glade and wipe out the Circle of Destruction, and that's the point when I will do the first ritual. The second one is something I would probably put maybe in the monoliths, maybe in the black forests over here. Actually, probably the Black Forest would be the most advantageous location, while bypassing Hotek's Column and the Twisted Glade. And that way I would be able to do a ritual and take on Silostra, though that is certainly a difficult early game battle. So that's one of the major disadvantages, that in order to get even your good units, you need to unlock them via these marks of ruination. But on top of that, when you unlock them, you only have capacity for 1. To increase the capacity, you need to spend Dread. And Dread can be spent on a number of things: legendary lords, unit caps, upgrades, and you can also use money that you gain in the campaign on various items, various benefits. There is a lot of power in this meter, but you gain Dread by fighting battles or through a particular structure that you can upgrade. In fact, one of the best things you can do as the beastman is just get a lot of these structures to a higher level, so you can get a lot of dread per turn, unlock a lot of armies, increase the army capacity over here through dread, get more of that dread, get the upgrades over here for hearthstones, and don't bother with the unit caps. One of the problems with this is you're encouraged, if you're playing a campaign as the beastman, to not bother with the unit caps until you've got the lords and more importantly, until you've gotten these upgrades over here, like Lords and Heroes, recruiting rank 5, new Horde armies are raised with encampment level F2 and with certain structures, and going all the way to Lords and Heroes being recruited at rank 15. So there's a lot of power, but there's also a pretty nasty grind to deal with over here when you are playing as the beastmen. That is the issue with this race. That is the downside of this race, and this will force you to play a lot of battles manually because your armies, your early game armies, just aren't really that great. Yes, they're free, but outside of like the few units you do start, like Minotaurs in Tarx's case, outside of those kind of few units that you do start with, actually getting good units, with the exception of like Ungor Raiders, is going to be a problem in your campaign. The dumb thing in this campaign, by the way, would be to actually increase unit caps for things like Razorgurs or Ungors. That is a really bad idea, because you're just going to waste dread that you should save up to get more armies, to get more higher level Hearthstones to protect your campaign. So the early game is the main issue. Once you get going, you do get going, and no one can really stop you. One particular piece of advice over here: if you're going to play a Beastman campaign, just make your life easier. Accept the fact that the early game is going to be pretty crap, and just don't torture yourself over it. Just set the battle difficulty, even if you're playing on Legendary, just set a battle difficulty to easy, unless you're going for some achievement run or something like that. And that's not necessarily, this is not necessarily the race for that. Set the battle difficulty to easy for the first few turns. Do that once you've unlocked some good units. That's the point when you can set the battle difficulty to hard, so you're not dealing with that tortured experience in the early game. So lots of power at the Beastmen, lots of Lord power, lots of benefits to the faction, but just the annoying mechanics at the moment of Ruination and Dread. They haven't necessarily aged well. When Creative Assembly changed the Beastmen, they certainly made them a very fun race, but like I think with other races that got these kind of reworks, like some of the fun... Not some of the fun. The Beastmen were never funny before that, but they also created new issues. And you can see this in how useful Beastmen AI characters, like all their Legendary Lords, are just footnotes in every single campaign. With the exception of Mogre, none of them accomplish anything of note. They all die, they all end up failing. And the only reason Mogre accomplished anything in his campaign is he's got a lot of these settlements next to him. He's going to raise some of them to the ground, he's going to get some ruination, and he has a fairly protected Hearthstone that only Ikaclaw really is going to destroy. Though they do tend to end up going to war with one another during that campaign. You can judge a faction or a race by how well their AI does, and the Beastmen tend to do very poorly. It's because of these caps. We have the Skaven. Oh, the mighty Skaven. They are pretty powerful and scary race, actually, on the campaign map. They have a lot of combat ability. They have scalability in their economy. They can earn a lot of money during the course of the campaign. Though certainly not as much as some other races, but they will also earn quite a bit of money from sacking and looting settlements. What are the benefits of the Skaven? Well, they have a good army roster specifically, though it depends on the units you're using and how you're using them. So if you're going to use Rowling Gunners or Jezzails, you're going to find yourself in a situation where the effectiveness of a lot of your units aren't quite as great as advertised, because gunpowder units are pretty crap. However, things like Poison Wind Mortars, Death Globe Bombardiers, and then Gutrunner Slingers, like Catapults, the Heroes, they're all pretty good. And the Legendary Lords are also very, very competent in battle. Like, they flat out have some of the best fighters, some of the best some of the best Legendary Lord fighters in the entire game. I'm trying to find him. There he is. Snitch over here, he was designed to go toe-to-toe with Malice Darkblade. And he absolutely can go toe-to-toe with someone like Malice Darkblade and do a lot of damage. So the Skaven have powerful armies. Here's the downside, though, of their very powerful armies. You're going to have to fight a lot of these battles manually, because one of the things they auto-resolve cares above all other considerations is armor. It certainly feels like that. Or the damage you're taking from the auto-resolve is dependent on the armor of your unit. No joke, an army like this is capable of probably dealing with an endgame crisis, but you wouldn't necessarily see that. You wouldn't necessarily see that in the auto-resolve. In fact, you might lose some very easily winnable battles during the course of your campaign. So this is a kind of campaign where you're going to have to fight a lot of battles manually. This is a similar issue with the vampire counts, though I feel more often than not it's actually worse with skaven because you just don't have the ability of bringing free stacks like the vampire counts have towards every issue. That is one of the problems that you're going to encounter with this campaign. But honestly, it's the least of your issues playing as skaven. Other problems that the skaven do face, genuine ones at that, is the way they increase one particular hero capacity. So Warlock Engineers are one of the best heroes, if not the best hero of the skaven. The problem is you need a tier 5 settlement to increase your Warlock Engineer capacity. As you might imagine, that is a pretty significant pain in the neck, even for skaven. Now, you do have a way of increasing your Warlock Engineer capacity through a right with a 30-turn cooldown, so that's pretty annoying. But what you do with it is you summon a special Warlock Engineer that can set up a special underway type settlement. And this specific Undercity will give you the Warlock Laboratory, which will give you experience return for Warlock Engineers, as well as 1 hero capacity for them, for each of them, with a 30-turn cooldown. Now, Skaven do have another way of dealing with it, but and that's, of course, to get tier 5 settlements, which they can do probably faster than any other race in the entire game. Like, this is turn 67. Skaven Blight and the capital of Tylea over here are both tier 5. And I might have at least some other tier 4 and tier 5 settlements, or settlements getting ready to go into tier 5. Like I've got the Black Tower of Archon ready to go into tier 5. The problem is, while you do have a lot of good growth with this, the main way you do it is by taking over a settlement and using food to grow the settlement level. Needless to say, getting a settlement to tier 4 or tier 5 is going to be very, very expensive in food. And therein lies one of the issues. Now, when you also, Skaven, if you don't spend food, will only take settlements at tier 1. This isn't really important early on in a campaign, but it is very important later on during the course of a campaign, because to get their settlement, to actually get the useful settlement, you do need to spend food. My advice would be to probably not spend food for regions or minor settlements, but only spend it for provincial capitals. Don't waste it on these minor settlements, because you do have pretty decent growth. Like, you have a structure that you should always build that gives you 40 growth. Your main settlements start at tier 1 with 12 growth. That's decent enough, and go all the way to 36 for minor settlements, up to 60 for provincial capitals. But the food aspect is actually one of the substantial drawbacks of the Skaven when it comes to it. Also, the fact that whenever Skaven takes settlements, you're basically looting and occupying it. The issue with that is you're inflicting a significant amount of public order penalty, and that, in general, will cause rebellion. Like, let's say you take a province with 3 regions. You take those 3 regions one after another, like Tylea here. You can take this very quickly once you get going. Suffice it to say, you will almost certainly get a rebellion in this kind of situation. So that is something of an annoyance. So rebellions can give you experience and money, which is always useful. The food problem, however, is not something that's easily fixable, unfortunately, because you don't really have a structure that gives you food. You do have a commandment that gives you 2 food. The problem is, however, that settlements themselves will consume food. So the bigger the empire you're building, the more food you consume. There's very few structures that give you food. For instance, Tylea is the Blackcorn Swamp. You can use that commandment. There's also a right that gives you free food per turn, but you may end up genuinely end up in a food deficiency. Now, if you have high food, that's good growth control, but if you have low food, you get substantial economic downsides. This, by the way, where you should never go into starving for food. Like, food shortage you can deal with, but starving for food when it comes to that post-battle loot and income from raiding or income from sacking and looting settlements is something you almost never want to see during the course of your campaign. Now, one of the better ways of dealing with the food crisis is to build undercities, because there is a particular structure, or rather there are structures that can give you quite a lot of food. And if you're playing a Skaven, one of the things you're probably going to want to do in every single campaign is to get some of these scavenger hordes, some of these undercities, in order to generate food during the course of your campaign. For instance, over here, I have several undercities, though I've been lacking in money. Like, money isn't necessarily the issue with Skaven. You may not generate as much as the High Elves, for instance, but your armies are not really so expensive, nor are your structures so ridiculous expensive. In fact, playing as a Skaven campaign, like, yes, some structures can be ridiculously expensive, but not all of them. Like, look at this. The Warpstone Reactor, only 2,400, and that's a very substantial structure. The Warp Turbine Plant, 3,200, though granted, Konda does get some benefits when it comes to that. But when we're looking at the structures, a lot of them, especially at the lower level, they're pretty cheap. Like, at the high level, yes, you will spend a lot, but when we're looking at a very low level with these structures, the structures themselves can be pretty cheap. So, net income-wise, you're generally speaking not going to run out of money during the course of this campaign, and you certainly will generate a lot of money through looting and sacking settlements. Though you do still have to care about money. I would say the more annoying factor during the course of this campaign is having to bother with the food situation constantly. Constantly dealing with food shortages, constantly planning your campaign around that, building undercities, expanding those undercities, and then having to fight a lot of battles manually that you'll win very, very easily otherwise, because the auto-resolve is just that biased against you. But there is a significant power in this campaign. Skaven can steamroll, they can get access to high-tier units, they can get access to really powerful artillery, range units, not just elves and rallying gunners, but gutter runners. With poison wind mortars, globadiers, all that, plague claws. Those are really good units, and the damage they do is extraordinary. So the Skaven absolutely do have power during the course of their campaign. At number 2, we have the Wood Elves. Now, the Wood Elves do have a pretty good roster, pretty good heroes, pretty good lords, and legendary lords, including some of the most powerful in the game. Actually, the most powerful in the game at the moment, with Ryan just being able to throw in a lot of armies for 0 upkeep. He just needs to pay the recruitment cost. That would be a significant benefit. But what are the issues with the Wood Elves? Well, when we're looking at their situation, one, their economy can feel a bit limited, because while they can generate a lot of money through the various trees that they have, they're only really going to be able to generate money from those trees. So that's going to limit their campaign potential when it comes to their economy. Beyond that, the only other major issue is that they don't have any siege units, any ranged siege units. They do have treekin and tree spirits, tree men that can do very well in a siege battle, but for most of the roster, it's not suited for a siege battle, which can be a problem in certain situations, like over here with the Sisters of Twilight. There is Hag Hall to attack, so that could be a bit of an issue. But really, the Wood Elves don't have any significant problems. They have limitations on their campaign, but they don't have any real significant problems when it comes to that. Their playstyle is pretty good. If there is any issue, it's the fact that you're generally encouraged to go for Glade Guard and Way Watchers, and then Treekin and Treemen as the mainstay of your army. So a lot of the units that you see for the Wood Elves are just not really worth recruiting in any way, shape, or form, because Treekin and Glade Guard are just really cost effective and really good units when it comes down to it. I mean, you can go with Way Watchers if you just want the full-on range power that they do provide, because they are the best range unit that you do have. But it is a bit of a shame that you have quite a big roster of units, but you're only really going to be using like 2 units, 3 units, 4 at most of that entire roster. 5 if you're playing the Sisters of Twilight, because then you can make good use out of Hawk Riders because of their faction-wide ability, but that's really going to be about it. Honestly, the biggest issue with the Wood Elves is that, yes, they are a very powerful race, but they're also incredibly boring to play. It's impossible, more or less, to lose a campaign as the Wood Elves, because you do have these fortresses, these woods, these trees that have really powerful garrisons, get even stronger garrisons as they go up in level, and the AI tends to not want to attack these kind of settlements, let alone something like Alpha Lorem with its It's many trees. It's 5 trees over here, including the Oak of Ages, providing a fairly formidable defensive situation over here in Alpha Lorem. So the Wood Elves can't really lose a campaign if you're playing that as them. It's very, very difficult to do so. And while this is true for the Beastmen and Warriors of Chaos as well, I would say that at least those campaigns can have a lot of fun in them. Whereas if you're playing as the Wood Elves, you're never really gonna have any sense of challenge because you're playing a defense-oriented campaign. What you really need to do, the only thing you really need to do during the course of your campaign is take these regions surrounding the various woods, get the woods, the HP of these woods to get the forest health to a high level, do the ritual, and then you're basically done in that area. And you have very powerful armies, especially when it comes to field battles. The Wood Elves are one of the better races that are out there. So it's not really a great campaign in a lot of ways. I mean, if you want a campaign where you're just steamrolling the enemy and then you're just AFKing for dozens and dozens and dozens of turns, this can be a campaign for you. But if you want the campaign to actually give you a sense of challenge or give you something to do that requires active participation, like, yeah, the Warriors of Chaos may have very easy campaigns, but at least you do have to get involved in those campaigns, whereas as the Wood Elves, you can be very passive a lot of the times and still win the campaigns when it comes to that, or to achieve the long campaign victory condition. The campaign victory, the domination campaign victory, or the ultimate endgame crisis, of course, that's a bit different, but probably better off if you play as the Wood Elves to actually enable the endgame crisis to spawn earlier than you might in other campaigns. That's the downsides with the Wood Elves. They are powerful. They've got a lot going for them. They do have limits, of course, when it comes to the economy, or rather, they have limits because they can only take so many settlements, and they can only take those special settlements, those trees, those woods. But the main issue is just how boring and forgettable a lot of their campaigns can be. Finally, at number 1, we have Grand Cathay. Cathay is a powerful race, but it sure does represent a race that does have significant downsides in their campaigns, despite the power at their disposal. Let's talk about the power, though, that they do have. Let's explore that aspect. First off, although their unit roster is limited, they do have some really good choices, be it Jade Warriors, Crossbowmen, regular Jade Warriors, or Jade Warriors with Halberds. These units right here for the main building chain are actually some really, really cost-effective and really effective units in battles. Like, if you just make armies of Jade Warriors with maybe some artillery, you will have some really powerful forces at your command. They also do have artillery choices. They have artillery at tier 3 that is capable of taking down walls, which is something the Empire doesn't have, for instance. Actually, a lot of races don't have this kind of artillery at tier 3. They get it later. So having this kind of artillery is actually very significant because it allows you to deal with sieges a lot better. On top of that, they do have a pretty solid economy or economic choices, as well as gaining a benefit from trade tariffs. And Cathay itself is one of the best areas of the game. What are the downsides? Well, there are many. First off, the caravan system. The caravan system can generate you a huge amount of gold throughout the course of your campaign. However, one of the things you're going to encounter pretty quickly during the course of the campaign is that the caravan routes are going to end up being very unsafe. And you're also likely going to see caravans being attacked by certain factions that are along the way, not by the caravan events. That is a problem because it makes those caravan routes that less safe. So that is a major issue to deal with when you are deciding to play Grand Cathay during the course of a campaign. Because the caravans do represent a significant portion, can represent a significant amount of money that you gain, especially early on. Then there's the whooshing compass. The wishing compass gives you a lot of benefits, be it income for buildings plus 15% or casualty replenishment, I would say are the two most significant ones that you can get. And of course growth as well when it comes down to it. From my perspective, the whooshing compass, however, is something of an annoyance to use, because yes, you do want, because you would generally want to have all of these effects together. For instance, if I'm playing a campaign, generally one of the things that I do care about would be to have both good growth, income, and casualty replenishment. As Cathay, you have to choose. Speaking about casualty replenishment, you don't have any hero or any option to improve casualty replenishment if you're playing as Cathay, with the exception of one particular building, and it's a yin building. Speaking about yin, yin and yang, one of the more annoying things as Cathay is, of course, the balance of harmony between yin and yang. And it's very easy to get completely out of balance if you're playing Cathay. There's no buffer. I think if there was a buffer of at least a couple of points that you might be able to increase in research, Cathay would be a lot better to play, a lot more fun to play in a significant number of ways. But as things currently stand, Cathay does suffer from that issue, because you do have a really good army at your disposal. Jade Warriors, like if we're thinking about it, like Jade Warriors as a tier 1 infantry unit, they're amazing units. Like if we look at their cost, they're pretty cheap, they're very heavily armored. They're actually just as heavily armored or even more heavily armored than even higher tier units. That gives them an extraordinary use in battle if you are playing as Cathay, because having heavily armored units will help you in out-resolve, will help you in battles, will ensure you pick the battles where you're taking fewer casualties. But the unit roster can certainly feel very boring as well. And beyond that, the final thing with Cathay is that while Cathay as an area of the campaign map is great, Cathay does have the Cathayan factions have one major issue. A lot of the terrain outside of Cathay is terrain they can't take, with the exception of the Empire, though having to go for the Darklands, having to cover the entirety of the Mountains of Morn and Darklands to get to the Empire to get colonizable territory isn't really that great. And there lies the problem. If you're playing Cathay, you do have limits to your campaign expansion because of the territorial types that you do have during the course of your campaign. You also have to deal with the Great Bastion, which sounded much better in theory than it actually ended up being, though they have since improved that situation by quite a bit. But still, the Great Bastion and having to defend the wall, so to speak, is something of an annoyance, especially if you're playing as Miao Ying over here. So quite a few issues during the course of a campaign, but make no mistake, this is a powerful race. They have a really good army. They have good legendary lords. Their regular lords, however, are not really that great, because you have the choice between the Lord Magistrate and the dragon-blooded Shungan. And the problem is the Lord Magistrate is just really bad, has a choice in a lot of ways. And while the dragon-blooded are okay, they're okay as a caster, absolutely. They're not an exceptional choice of a lord either. So, regardless of how you cut it, there are going to be limitations during the course of the campaign. Like, Cathay is the only race that Creative Assembly introduced in Warhammer 3 that actually works pretty well in Immortal Empires, despite all these issues. But these issues do absolutely exist. Anyway, that's all there is to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. And I'll see you boys and girls next time.